Hi everyone, David Aragona and Craig Milkowski here taking a look at the feature race on Saturday at Woodbine. It is race 9, the Grade 1 EP Taylor Stakes, going a mile and a quarter on the turf for fillies and mares. And Craig, we've got a pretty intriguing field of 9 runners signed on for this race. Chad Brown has sent a couple of older females up to Woodbine to contest this spot, but we've also got a couple of intriguing 3-year-olds that are stepping up to face their elders, including Moira, that filly who won the Queen's Plate earlier in the year.
I found both of the 3-year-olds intriguing here, both Moira and Milady, who's shipping in from Germany, ran pretty well in the German Oaks this year. It's not the strongest Grade 1 we're going to see, so I do actually think those 3-year-olds have to be considered contenders, something I don't often say in turf races for 3 and up.
Yeah, here is the field for this race. As you can see, Rougier listed as the slight favorite on the morning line, that one going out for the Chad Brown stable. I suspect, though, Craig, that Moira, the number 3, is going to take a lot of money in here. She's got a large following, as you would expect, being a filly that did beat the boys in the Queen's Plate, but she is making her first start on turf after having so much success on the synthetic surface, so we'll see how she handles the grass. Let's take a look at the Timeform US pace projector for this race before we get into the contenders. And Craig, a bit of a murky pace scenario, to say the least, because not too many in this field are confirmed front runners, though I would say the outside horse Fev Rover and the number 2 Adventuring have at least gone to the front at different points in the past.
I don't think this is a race that the pace is going to be that big of a consideration, which might seem odd for somebody largely responsible for making the pace projector. But at this mile and a quarter distance on turf, it's not a huge field. Woodbine's such a big course. I think everybody's going to be able to get the trip they want. It's not like there's horses in here who are just deep closers and need a ton of pace either.
Well, as we discuss the contenders, let's begin by talking about some of the older horses in this EP Taylor, beginning with one of the local preps for it. That was the Grade 2 Canadian run back in August. Let's take a look at the stretch run of that race. And Fev Rover hooks up with Crystal Cliffs, who ultimately photos with her for the win. In between them there is Flirting Bridge. She's kind of left by those top 2 in mid-stretch. She does rally on to finish beaten less than a length in third. But Craig, I thought this was a pretty game effort by Fev Rover, who did get away with some moderate fractions early, but really had to battle hard in the late stages to earn this victory.
It was a very game effort. As a matter of fact, I think the other rider thought he had actually won the race, but Fev Rover just kept digging in, held on by the scantest of noses, and it was a good effort. As you say, there wasn't a lot of pace. We can see it in the Timeform US running line. All the fractions are in blue, but it's not like Fev Rover had a huge head start. Crystal Cliffs had drawn even with her, and I thought it was a good effort. If Crystal Cliffs was in this race, I would be willing to bet she would probably be the favorite off of that effort. So good effort from her. Doesn't seem like she's going to have much pace to deal with, so she seems like a contender to me for sure.
Yeah, I guess the big concern for Fev Rover could be the stretch out to the mile and a quarter distance. She really concentrated on 1 mile races when she was a pretty good 3-year-old filly in Europe. The mile and an eighth that she tried last time was the farthest that she's gone in this country. She did once try a mile and a quarter in Bahrain, her last start overseas. But she's by a sire who I think is more known as a sprinter miler influence. So we'll see if she can get the added distance. But based on that last race, she's definitely a contender in here. As would, I would say, the third place finisher in that Canadian, Flirting Bridge, who is the number 6 in this race. I thought she stayed on pretty well to be third in there. And like Fev Rover, she's going to be trying to stretch out to this mile and a quarter. But her connections seem to think the distance is not going to be a problem, because she was actually entered to go a mile and 3/8 in the Weah at Belmont at Aqueduct last week. I think because of the condition of the turf course, they scratched out of that spot, and they found a tougher race for her up in Canada.
Right. She ran in the Penning Memorial at Parks, finished behind Princess Grace, who's went on to do some good things both at Churchill and Kentucky Downs. Then she stretched out a little further in that Canadian. And of the two, if you had to pick which horse was going to like the mile and a quarter, the most, she sure finished it off the strongest. You can see her pace figures increase pretty steadily, particularly in that last eighth of a mile. So that has to be a good sign for going longer.
Yeah, I don't anticipate distance is going to be a big problem for Flirting Bridge. She is the daughter of Camelot, who's known as a strong stamina influence in Europe. She was so visually impressive in her US debut at Churchill Downs back at the end of May. Arguably hasn't really taken a step forward since then, but as you can see, she's got those blue color coded pace figures in her running line, so arguably has been a little bit against it. I think she's pretty interesting in this spot. Craig, we do have to talk about both of the Chad Brown runners in this race. Let's begin with Rougier, who's listed as the shorter price of the two on the morning line. We'll go all the way back to her first start of the year in the Beaugay when she won so impressively at Belmont this day, was beating a field that she was supposed to handle pretty easily. She went off as the 3-5 favorite. Lamista, who runs here, is also in this field. She finishes behind her. I think the big question is with Rougier, Craig, is just what's happened to her form since then, because she certainly hasn't gone forward.
Something we both talked about it is we wonder if she's just a horse who doesn't like firm turf courses. When you see her overseas form, she did good on soft courses, not so well on better ones. And here in the States, even though I'm throwing out the official track designations you see here, that Beverly D at Churchill, that was a crazy turf course. I think you can put a line through that one. But regardless of the condition of the course, it was still a pretty quick one. And then we have two firm course starts at Saratoga and Belmont. The one before that in the Beaugay, the one we just watched, even though it says it was firm, it was clearly not based on the Timeform US track condition rating. And that kind of matches what we've seen overseas. So she's a favorite. And you mentioned it in the beginning. I'm not sure she'll be the actual favorite. But if it's a firm course at Woodbine, I'm not using her.
Yeah, I suppose there's some irony in them labeling that turf course at Churchill last time as good in the PPs, but I'm willing to give her a pass for that race because it seemed like a lot of horses just didn't handle that. But her prior two races still a little bit disappointing, and I agree with your point about maybe her liking some given the ground. Maybe she'll get a bit of that. There's been a lot of rain on the East Coast. I'm not sure how much of that is going to hit Woodbine. I know there was some rain that they got on Thursday, so we'll see how soft the turf course does come up for Rougier, but I still have some questions about whether she can get back to that Beaugay form that we saw earlier in the year. As for the other Chad Brown trainee, Lamista, let's take a look at her victory too back when she won the Matchmaker at Monmouth. She was beating a weaker field this day, Craig, but I thought she battled on pretty gamely to get the better of Fluffy Socks. Arguably, that one had the slightly tougher trip covering more ground, but she's another who's coming off a pretty lackluster effort last time in the Boston Spa.
Right. It's probably not a good sign that we had to go further back in the PPs for these two for Chad Brown. Her speed figure when she won was decent, but I think that was one that was largely boosted because she got kind of a slow pace being right up front. Finished it off pretty good, and the form for that race hasn't really been that great. So I tend to judge her more on the Boston Spa than I do on the Matchmaker.
And I know that you found a DRF Formulator fact for the Chad Brown stable that's probably worth considering given where this race is run. Up at Woodbine, Chad Brown does not have as strong numbers as you might expect. The ROI is very low. The win percentage is just mediocre. So it's not like he's had a ton of success shipping horses up to Woodbine.
Right. And I think, to be fair, it's not like he ships his A string to Woodbine very often. It's usually these horses in the States who've been running in grade 3 listed races, maybe a week grade 2. So it's not all that surprising, but I just wonder if people don't automatically see the Chad Brown name and gravitate towards those horses when they really don't have that big of an edge at all when they ship north to Canada.
I think that's a good point, and I think that stat does fit Rougier and Lamista for that reason, because they are definitely not among his A string at this point in time. Let's move on to talk about those 2 3-year-olds that we were mentioning at the beginning of our preview, beginning with the horse that I think both of us agree could go favored in this spot. That's the number 3 Moira, and we'll take a look at her last out victory when she beat the boys in the Queen's Plate. Craig, of course, this was run over the Tapeta track at Woodbine. She has never been on the turf before, at least not in the afternoon, but all evidence from pedigree suggests that it's not supposed to be a problem for her.
It shouldn't be, but it is a question mark. I'm not one who automatically assumes horses that move from turf to synthetic or vice versa are going to handle it, because that simply isn't true. Some do, some don't. And you kind of got to look at the breeding and look at the individual. So it will always be a question until they actually do it. But it's hard not to be impressed by this filly. She's improved her time for an U.S. speed figure every time out. Her last two races in that the Oaks and then the Queen's Plate, she just absolutely dusted the field. Seemed like she had plenty more in the tank. I'm not saying she would have ran 120 speed figures or anything, but she wasn't under a lot of stress. And I just like the way she finishes off her races. So I actually think she's really dangerous in here, despite stepping up to face older.
Yeah, she is clearly in fantastic form right now. Those last two victories have been very dominant, and she's arguably been flattered by the runner-up and the third-place finisher in the Queen's Plate. I think the latter came back to win the Breeder Stakes on turf recently, so she beat a pretty good field last time and did so decisively. But like you were saying, how short a price do you want to take on a horse that's trying something new for the first time? I don't think you're going to get that 3-1 morning line. I imagine she'll get that down off that. The pedigree is there. Her dam was grade 2 placed on the turf. She's a half to a stakes winner on the turf, so she's supposed to handle it, but I think you have to decide for yourself what is the right value for you on Moira. Another 3-year-old that I think is a little bit interesting in this race is the number 8, My Lady, who's shipping in from Germany. This one ran in the German Oaks last time. Let's take a look at the stretch run of that race at Dusseldorf. And she finished up pretty well this day, Craig. Obviously showed that she handles added ground, going the 11 furlongs on this occasion. Arguably flattened out a little bit at the end, but she was beaten by a horse that we are a little bit familiar with, Toscana Belle, because we saw her not so long ago at Aqueduct.
Right, and I think I actually picked Toscana Belle in that race, and she ran fine. She wasn't able to get the win, but she ran a good second, ran a good speed figure that day. And I do think Milady had some excuses on this day. If you watch the entire race, which is available on YouTube, you can see she lost quite a bit of ground. And we talked about it before. I'm not going to put too much weight on those time form ratings because she is a 3-year-old. They tend to be a little bit lower than what we have on our scale. So I think she fits in this field. With any improvement at all, she could be dangerous.
One more horse that we probably should discuss, just because she's listed as a short price on the morning line, is the number 2, Adventuring. Craig, she's coming off a victory at Kentucky Downs, a track that she has won at before. So she's definitely one of these that does like that unique surface at Kentucky Downs. I just question the quality of the field she beat and whether her prior form really makes her a contender in here. But at the very least, she does figure to be a pace factor.
Right. I wouldn't be surprised if she's setting the pace in this race. I didn't see her as going off quite this short. I'm not going to pretend to be a morning line maker at Woodbine, but I wouldn't want any parts of her at 7-2. It looks like she really likes Kentucky Downs. Her other races don't really inspire me to want to bet on her. And particularly that last one, when she won at a time when the rail was a good place to be, the speed was good for sure. Basically the entire meet. She was up close most of the way. So it's just a race. I've talked about it many times. I generally put a line through those Kentucky Downs races when horses ship out, and the rest of the races just, I don't want any parts of her.
Let's take a look at the top picks for both Craig and I in this EP Taylor Stakes. And we've got pretty much the same horses in the mix, Craig, just sorted them in a slightly different order. You're going for that Queen's Plate winner, Moira. She's the one that's coming in here with all the upside.
Yeah, I was a little surprised when I made my picks. I hadn't seen the morning line yet, but I've just really been impressed with her. I think she's actually the most likely winner, despite being a 3-year-old. I wouldn't take her if she's 2-1, 5-2. I'd probably have to think about it. And 3-1, I definitely would. And then the other horses we talked about in here, we're pretty close. I do like your selection who you're going to get to. If she's anywhere near the morning line, she'd be one I would be betting as well.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how they do bet this race, but ultimately I decided the Canadian was one of the stronger preps for this, and I just like the stretch out and distance for the number 6 Flirting Bridge. I thought that she was finishing well into that relatively slow pace last time. I think she'll get the 10 furlongs, and if a little more pace does develop this time, maybe she can turn the tables on Fev Rover and beat some of the others. And like you said, she's a nice price on the morning line. We'll see if that holds up in the EP Taylor Stakes at Woodbine on Saturday. Good luck if you're playing the races this weekend.